6 months on, have Japan's new whiskey standards brought balance to the force? Or are we still on the dark side? Welcome to Kanpai Planet. I'm Mac, bringing you the world of Japan's drinks direct from the heart of Tokyo. In February 2021, Japan's whiskey industry released new standards for producing and labelling Japanese whiskey. Why did we need them? Check out my 2 previous videos on this very subject to find out. But here's a brief recap. Historically, the National Tax Agency has driven Japan's drinks regulation, but they're not really concerned about transparency or terroir. As a result, a lot of what looked like Japanese whiskey actually wasn't. It fell to an industry body, the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association, to announce new standards to try to address these issues. They took effect on the 1st of April 2021 with a 3-year grace period for products already in the market. So, has anything actually changed in the last 6 months? Well, quite a lot actually, some for the better and some for the worse. Soon after the announcement, Taiko Nakamura, founder of the Shizuoka distillery, released a series of blog posts giving us much more insight into how the JSLMA standards were crafted and what they really mean. In 2016, a cabal of Japan whiskey's Big Five was convened. Suntory, Nikka, Kirin, Honbo Shuzo, i.e. Mars Whisky, and Venture Whisky, aka the Chichibu distillery. Other distilleries founded post-2008, after Chichibu, were not consulted and were not even updated on progress. That's very important to appreciate. The 2 biggest importers of bulk whiskey, Suntory and Nikka, were the guys who masterminded this. Were they cutting off their nose to spite their face? Not really. The products that use this imported liquor are on the whole cheap blends that are intended for a domestic market that frankly doesn't care where their drinks come from. Discussions took place until early 2021, when the standards, which are intended to apply to worldwide sales of domestically produced liquor, were released. How were these new standards going to be enforced? Surely offenders couldn't use Japanese names, and they had to write "not Japanese whiskey" clearly on the bottle, right? Well, this was the subject of the final blog post in the Nakamura trilogy, and unlike the 3rd Godfather film, it was well worth waiting for.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
It turns out that the restrictions on Japanese names that can be put on non-Japanese whiskey only apply to Japanese proper nouns. Meiji, Taketsuru, Tokugawa, Fujisan, Kyoto. Common nouns are not in violation of the standards. For example, Kirin's Riku whiskey, where Riku means land. So, I hope you paid attention to your grammar lessons at school, but this is where things start to get bizarrely circular. See, apparently you can use Japanese proper nouns on whiskies that don't meet the new standards, provided you make it clear that the whiskies are non-compliant. How do you, as a consumer, know that? Well, manufacturers have to disclose statements along the following lines. This is not Japanese whiskey, or this product does not use Japan-made spirit, or, and this is my favourite one, matured under 3 years in a wooden cask under 700 litres. Because you'd need a pretty detailed knowledge of drinks manufacturing to understand that that meant you weren't buying whiskey. I know what you're thinking, but it gets even better. Where do these disclosures have to be made? Surely on the bottle, right? Wrong. They could be on the bottle, but they could instead be on the company's website or disclosed in response to a consumer inquiry. That's right. If you're on the other side of the world shopping and you're wondering if that bottle that you're staring at is true Japanese whiskey, you have to email customer services or call the distillery or check their website, possibly in Japanese. This shift of responsibility onto consumers is pervasive. Jota Tanaka, master blender at Kirin, has in conversation with Dave Broom said, "We encourage consumers to ask each producer's customer service whenever any confusions or questions are raised. Similarly, Suntory's chief blender Shinji Fukio says, we recommend that consumers check with the manufacturer if the product you're looking for is Japanese whiskey. How many people would even think to call a cheesemaker to confirm that their Parmesan was really made in Parma? The fact we're even talking about this means these rules are not yet tight enough. And quite frankly, a simple holographic seal on JSLMA compliant whiskies would solve almost all these problems. Those under the radar blog posts were instrumental in exposing these issues. Take a bow, Taiko. Remember, these standards only apply to JSLMA members. Not every drinks maker is a member, plus there's no penalties for non-compliance. Your argument could be that no self-respecting JSLMA member would violate the spirit, pun intended, of these standards because, as we like to say here, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. Well, how about if they rebranded the nail? That appears to be what Matsui Whisky have done with the Kyoto Miyako distillery. I've called out Matsui Whisky before. They began distillation in their Kurayoshi distillery in 2017, and yet they sell an 18-year-old whiskey branded very much to look like Yamazaki 18. They represent much that is wrong with Japanese whiskey. Are they up to their usual tricks, downing Japan's former capital? The Kyoto Miyako distillery got their distillation license back in July 2020, but they'd found a way to already release their first bottles of juice in March 2021. If you saw a bottle of this, you'd be forgiven for thinking this was Japanese whiskey. I mean, it's clad in a woven obi, for whiskey god's sake. I was suspicious of the Kyoto Miyako distillery from the start. I mean, the font they use is very similar to Kurayoshi. Some digging reveals more. Kurayoshi and Kyoto Miyako use the same trademark proxy agent, web hosting, and Google Analytics tracking tag. The final piece of evidence is the best. Comments left on Kyoto Miyako's social media asking about their relationship with Matsui are immediately deleted. Why go to all this trouble? Well, Matsui Shuzo is a JSLMA member. And guess what? Kyoto Miyako is not. Charles Baudelaire once wrote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist." Well, the devil would have used a different web host. It's not all doom and gloom. Some distilleries have gone the other way and embraced the spirit of these new standards. The Toguchi brand from Sakurao Brewery and Distillery contained a blend of imported whiskey with whiskey it produced in Japan decades ago. Not quite as brazen as Kurayoshi, but their Toguchi bottles did prominently state Japanese blended whiskey. In recent times, the company has done a lot to repair its image. Their first two single malts, released in July 2021, are JSLMA compliant. They have the capacity to make grain whiskey too, and they've announced plans to release a true Japanese whiskey blend by summer 2023. It's interesting they went with the Toguchi brand for one of their single malts, given it's tainted by some of their past practices, but it's great to see them striving for redemption. In a statement released at the time of the new standards, the JSLMA point out that in Japan, distilleries don't swap stocks like they do in Scotland, but they don't say why. The reason goes back almost a century. Masataka Taketsuru, the founder of Nikka, used to work for Shinjiro Tori, the founder of Suntory, and the two had a massive falling out. A spat, a tiff, a Barney. As a result, the two companies have remained adversarial for almost 100 years. Now that is some professional grudge holding. Luckily, newer distilleries don't have this baggage. In March this year, two of Japan's smaller distilleries, Saburomaru and Nagahama, released the first bottles of blended malt whiskies in Japan to officially use swapped stocks. This was followed in April by the first stock swap release from two of Japan's big five, Venture Whiskey's Ichiro's Malt and Honbo Shuzo's Mars Whiskey. It may still be a cold day in hell before we see a collaboration between Suntory and Nikka, but with more distilleries such as Komasa Jozo, makers of single malt Kanosuke, distilling grain whiskey, we could soon see a new era of innovative Japanese blends. There was initially some confusion as to whether rice whiskies, met the new standards. In 2020, Suntory released a rice whiskey made at their Osumi distillery as part of the Essence of Suntory Whiskey Volume 4. It uses only malt for saccharification and fermentation. And that's the key. Rice isn't the JSLMA's enemy, it's Koji. Koji is the mold that characterizes Japanese alcohol, sake, shochu and awamori. It transforms starch to sugar, a process which is performed by malted barley or enzymes in the production of regular whiskey. This means that Essence of Suntory Volume 4 is a Japanese whiskey under the new standards, but the newly released Takamine whiskey from Honkaku Spirits, made from Koji fermented barley, is not. You might ask why this matters at all. Why not call the drink a different name? It's all about reaching and engaging new drinkers. You're far more likely to try something with the word whiskey on the bottle rather than, I don't know, Koji fermented barley booze. I think that excluding Koji misses the chance to celebrate something unique about Japan's food and drink culture. Koji fermentation has a history going back centuries, and it's not just alcohol. It gives us soy sauce, miso, and much more. It's unlikely, but I really hope a change in the standards addresses this. Over the last 6 months, I've noticed an interesting shift through the Kubler-Ross change curve as a result of the announcement of these standards from both industry commentators and regular tipplers. Any bad blood that may have come out of the announcement has only galvanized Japanese whiskey secondary market pricing. We actually saw an acceleration in price growth in the immediate aftermath of the announcement. I have noticed two distinct backlashes, one at a national and one at an individual level. Every user needs an enabler. Where did we get all this whiskey to commit our blending? Scotland and Canada mainly, and what's happening now in Japan has shone a spotlight on the nations doing the bulk exporting. Many fans that adore the brands, Nicker from the barrel, that are not now Japanese whiskey, are proudly declaring that they don't care as long as the drink tastes good. And that's almost the entire point. This is an issue of transparency and disclosure, much more than an issue of provenance. Some world whiskey is fantastic, just clearly label it that way. I'm still cautiously optimistic that these standards may bring about substantial change, but where I knew this was going to be a long and winding road, I'm now convinced it's an uphill battle. Until next time, Kanpai.